You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
Last week, Yoseb and I were walking through Carved at Descanso with the rest of the family, and we got to talking about like nightmares, and I had asked him if he had ever had one of those sleep paralysis nightmares, and he said no, and so then I followed up and I said, so I guess you've never had like the sleep paralysis demon? And he was like, no, what is that? And I was like, well, it's a real phenomenon. It's mostly brought on by anxiety, where you lay in bed in that moment between sleep and awake, and you can't move and you can't scream, and you either see or sense a malevolent entity in the room with you. Anybody have one of those? No? Yeah? All right, there's my anxious people. There we go. I remember being afraid of the dark for a long time, fearful that there's some hidden monster that might jump out to get me. And seasons like Halloween kind of encourage us to examine our fears, particularly our fear of death, as we engage in this very human condition of wondering what, if anything, lies on the other side. And so today I'm going to read what feels like a Halloween passage from Matthew's Gospel. This is Matthew 27:45 through 54. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus on the cross cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, this man's calling for Elijah. And at once one of them ran and got a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to save him. And then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And after his resurrection, they came out from the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, truly this man is God's son. And so as Jesus is dying, it seems like the world is dying too. Unnatural darkness, earthquakes, and the dead coming out of their tombs. Literally seismic shifts happening as reality transitions to something new. But before it does, it's gonna get scary. You might remember back to those early days of the pandemic. I remember like around Christmas hearing an NPR report in 2019 that there was some sort of like unknown flu happening in China, but it'll be contained, nothing to worry about. It was like one of those scary movies where the TV's playing in the background to foreshadow what's about to happen. You might also remember that in that in-between transition period before we knew what was really happening, there was so much unknown that we started cleaning our groceries. You'll remember that? I'm just acting with panic because we just want some control in all of this scary stuff that we knew once schools closures began to last until the end of the school year, that life was going to be different from now on, even though we couldn't guess what it could be. Monsters, Inc. kind of establishes a similar feeling early on, that what has reliably worked for centuries, scaring children, just doesn't seem to be doing it anymore. New scare tactics were needed to be deployed. We needed A-list monsters who could get to the scare floor just to keep the power going in their world. And it's that kind of slow build of anxiety and worry. Did that door just move? Is that someone there in the corner? Oh no, it's just a jacket, thank God. That the fears developed before the scream, right? Before the jump scare, we hear that long, droning violin music. There's a lot out there that can make us afraid. Keeping our kids safe or successful, wondering if we're doing enough of everything. The election, climate change, financial stability, maintaining relationships, all of those are reasons to carry that anxiety like a pit in our stomach, just waiting for something to jump out and scare us. Behind every door in Monsters, Inc. is a new reality and a new reason to be afraid. Who knows what monsters might come out once you finally fall asleep? And typically the way the story works is those doors are meant to work one way, where the monsters enter from their world and into our world. But Boo makes her way to the monster world, and as a result introduces the terror that they had never experienced before, but that we know all too well, a human child. But as she comes in, she's going to introduce a new way of thinking about everything and shows how fear is insufficient in the face of joy and laughter. What we find in 3 out of the 4 Gospels is that the curtain of the temple is torn in two when Jesus dies, torn from top to bottom, as if heaven is tearing this threshold that was meant to separate its reality from our reality. The curtain was meant to protect us from the Holy of Holies. It was there, a very thick curtain, by the way, about maybe that thick, to keep the glory of God, the very presence of God, away from our prying eyes. Because as we've seen at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the Ark of the Covenant is revealed to the people, faces melt. And that's something that they had experienced, and so we needed this barrier. But here, this doorway would be breached in a surprising way. The presence of God now comes unrestricted, and instead of screaming and death and torment, what we find is that life erupts from this place as the temple curtain is torn. That the presence of God, though unseen, nevertheless has earth-shaking effects. The dead come to life again. You know, we often will imagine of us going to heaven when we die, us moving toward God, that when we find ourselves confused, that it is us who has to somehow will ourselves to discover the spiritual depths of the world around us, that somehow we have to cross this threshold into some new reality. We often rarely imagine what it might be when God's reality comes to us. You see, Jesus' final breath is the resuscitating breath that begins new creation. 3 days later in resurrection, we find that death is not the final experience for humanity. And it is not something that we must wait for when our own death comes, but instead that we can find this sort of life surprising us outside of tombs and in gardens and as we gather around a table. Now, that transition is no less shocking. You see, in the transition, as Jesus is breathing his last, he will cry out from the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" That Jesus will experience pain and thirst, loneliness, and even abandonment as this full experience of death is placed upon him. And I want us to think about that. Thirst and sorrow and grief and fear now embodied in the literal overlap of heaven and earth, that God and humanity has been joined together, and so God suffers. In fact, God dies so that God will overcome death with new life. You know, instead of our faith dismissing death or suffering or grief, papering it over and say, "Oh, it's going to be okay, we'll find it better on the other side." Instead of that, our faith knows death and suffering and grief. Before his death, Jesus told his followers that they should take up their cross to follow him. That we don't have to flinch from moments of loss or disruption, even though we still might cover our eyes a little bit. One of Israel's great prophets, Ezekiel, has this vision as he looks out over this valley of bones of his ancestors. And he sees how these bones now slowly begin to build sinew and muscle until they are all back to life. It was a vision where God's people would be restored to their land, that the promises that God had made to their ancestors would now come true after years and generations of setback. And so we find this life coming out of the tombs, literally. This vision of Ezekiel coming true. How life will then pour over the land that was no longer theirs. Rome had laid claim to it. And yet, the promises of God could not be held back. How somehow joy can find us even in the midst of fear. Somehow hope can be made true in spite of despair. That love can find us even in isolation. And like fear or laughter, the presence of God surprises us in ways that we didn't see coming. That you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I believe in life after death? I believe in hope after grief? Love after loss? That as corny as it sounds, I believe in the power of laughter and how it's greater than fear? Am I in some Disney cartoon? And yet there's part of us that wants to still hold on to that sense that nothing's going to be okay. And what the story of Christ on the cross tells us is that sometimes the scariest thing we can do is act as if our faith is true. That we don't have to ignore the suffering and sorrow, either that we experience or those around us. That we can believe that life follows death and not the other way around. That the pain of this world is meant to be tended to and not avoided. And that we have been given this presence of God before us so that we might feel comforted by it and comfort others through it. That somehow we find new life in the middle of a tomb or in the cries coming from a cross. And so my hope is that our imagination would be transformed in a way where we might see God face to face now. That we allow the reality of new life in heaven beyond this realm to break through whatever threshold we may put in front of it and discover that that imagination comes shining its truth into our present. And that even though we're afraid, we can be hopeful that joy always arrives. Amen.